be going over some hunter tips today. Just overview of the class, trait trees, stats you want to hit, kind of virtues you can use, and then go over some stuff like rotation and LIs, that whole deal. So to get started, hunter mainly, DPS class. It's currently one of the biggest single target DPS in the game, and also has a bunch of really strong AoE, especially with this current level cap and the hunter set bonus you can get. As far as when you're rolling a hunter, elf tends to be the best hunter class, mainly because of this racial trait right here, elf bow bonus, bow damage bonus. So that is not a 5% mastery bonus. That's a 5% base damage bonus, which makes elf just like it pound for pound out DPS any other hunter race. So that's, if you see a bunch of elf hunters around, that's the main reason why. Racials for elves also have a couple other nice things, like you get a bunch of fate, which fate's always nice, especially for things like power regen and whatnot. But yeah, it's mainly just that bow damage is the reason that elves are the kings of hunters. So when you are making a hunter and you want to make a trait tree, red hunter is the way to go, mainly because as the game is balanced right now, red hunter just out DPSs all the other hunter subtrees by a decent margin. Blue is mostly focused on moving around and shooting, which makes it kind of nice for landscape or PvP, but for PvE and raiding and whatnot, it just does way less damage, even if you factor in the moving. Yellow line is always a fun line, but sadly has been very poorly balanced recently. So it has some interesting debuffs, but the damage drop in yellow is just so significant that the debuffs can't make up for it completely. So red is where we end up going. So in red, there are a couple traits that you get no matter what you're building for, whether it be single target or AoE or tanky or anything like that. What I'm going to go through here will be a sort of a generic trait tree that you can use in raids or in 3-man, 6-man's, landscape, whatever. And then after, I'll kind of go through what I specifically use for raids and whatnot. So starting out here in red, the very first one we have here is True Shot, which True Shot just makes it so that one of your skills, Penetrating Shot, adds a incoming crit chance debuff. So at max rank, at 5 ranks, you'll have 10% extra ranged crit chance on whatever target has pen shot on it, which is incredibly strong. You're already sitting just anyways at around like 30 to 35% crit chance, depending on traits and gear and whatnot. So adding in another 10% on the target would mean against that target you're already at basically 40% chance crit with range skills. This is always a must-have for almost any hunter. There are some group comps where you can get away with not trading that, but I'll cover that later. But in like 99% of the time, you want to trait that. Next over is just straight crit chance, just 5% crit chance. This goes over cap of rating. So like with rating, you can get up to I think 25% crit chance, I believe. And so with this would get you up to like 30% crit chance. So this is always another must-have. Fast Draw, this is an interesting one. So Fast Draw makes it so that every time you use one of your base level skills, Quick Shot, it adds a stacking induction buff for yourself. So it makes your inductions go faster and faster the more that you use it. So putting 1 point in this makes it so that all your skills, or each stack of it from Quick Shot is a minus 6%. So that maxes out at minus 18%. So 1 point in this is very strong. each subsequent point adds 1% to that base buff. So when you stack it 3 times, you're basically adding 3% on top. So it goes from like 18, 21, 24, and then it caps out at 30%. At low levels, this one's really good to just put 1 point in and then save the other points for other skills when you don't have the max points you can use. For instance, one we'll talk about later is quick draw down here, which is just straight skill induction. It's like 1 point in this is much stronger than subsequent points in this, but the first point in fast draw is always going to be really good. So you always want to get at least 1 point in there. Max level, though, you got plenty of trait points to spare, so you can usually just kind of fill that out, get your inductions maxed out. Next line down, we have Heartseeker. Heartseeker is one of your biggest hitting skills on a hunter. It's one that you're almost always going to use the second that it's off cooldown. You want to be spamming as many Heartseekers as possible. The first point in this trait gets you Heartseeker. The second point in the trait gets you more bleed pulses on Heartseeker. So you definitely want to build that. Next over, we got Draw Weight, which is induction damage. So this affects all of your skills that are induction skills. So this is another one that's just really good to have. And then the max rank adds a crit multiplier to induction bow skills. So that just means when you crit with an induction skill, it will crit 15% harder with that max rank. So this is another one that you basically always want to have. There's never a reason to not trait that. This one is Swift and True. So Swift and True, it increases Swift Bow, which is another one of your skills, damage. But at that max rank, every time you use Quick Shot, there's a 20% chance that it will give you a buff that will make Swift Bow an instant cast, which is really nice in your rotation, because Swift Bow has a very long animation on its own, and so if you can get rid of the induction from it, that speeds the skill along a lot. So in general, this is another one that you always want to get in Redline. Also, Swift Bow is one of the harder hitting skills that you see in a Parse distribution. So next down is Quick Escape. This one it makes it so that your melee skill Low Cut applies a root and then lets you move around without losing focus. Focus being the sort of mechanic that's used to use hunter skills, which is kind of shown down at the bottom in the form of a meter. When you normally, as a red hunter, when you move, the focus starts to drain. But with this trait, if you use Low Cut, it'll give you then a buff so that you can move without losing focus. In PvE, this is not a very good trait. You don't usually need that root, and you can better use the points elsewhere in your build. For PvP, this one can be nice sometimes, but since this is a PvE focused build, we're going to ignore this one. We're not going to trait that. Next one will be Strength. It just increases the percent on Strength stance. So by base, this has a 5% focus and induction bow damage, which is actually base damage versus mastery, which makes it pretty strong. This maxing out will make that up to a 10%. And then there's also a legendary tracery that can get you another 2% or 2.5%, maybe, or is it up to 5%? I don't actually use that tracery, so I don't know off the top of my head. I have to look. But either way, that's for a strength stance build. In PvE, as soon as you are high enough levels to have LIs, precision stance is almost always going to be better than the strength stance. The actual damage that you can deal with them can be kind of similar, but precision stance has other benefits with it that lets you get more crits and makes Quick Shot crit more, and crits will reduce cooldowns of some of your important skills like Heartseeker and Upshot, which I'll talk about a bit later. But basically, precision stance is always the better option from strength from the minute you have LIs.
The gold tracery is 6.6%.
Oh, it adds another 6.6. All right, so that will get you up to 16.6% capped on strength stance, which in a strength build would be good. But yeah, in PvE, you basically always want to use precision. I'll touch a bit more on that later, but that's the long and short of it.
You lose so much from not getting the cooldown reduction from option.
Indeed, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. So next trait down is back to Heartseeker. So it makes the Heartseeker apply an incoming healing debuff, which can be useful in some circumstances. I believe that the tooltip says 50%. I think that very recently got nerfed to 15%. Just because now incoming healing debuffs stack with other classes, so you can stack them higher. But either way, that can be nice, especially in certain situations if you're fighting ads that can get healed. If you get a Heartseeker on them, I believe it lasts, it's 8 seconds, it says there in the tooltip. So you get that Heartseeker off within 8 seconds of the heal going off, they will just heal for less, which can be very handy. Also, it increases bleed damage, so this is one you always get. Next over is Mercy Kill, which affects Merciful Shot's crit damage. Merciful Shot is a skill that can be used after a target has hit a certain health threshold. Based on some traits and passives, that's either going to be like 50% or 70%. In red, it tends to be 70%. So once a target's after 70%, you can use Merciful Shot. That tends to crit extra hard. Currently, Merciful Shot is kind of broken in that it interacts poorly with LIs. As soon as you start improving this with a passive trait that I'll talk about in a second, it basically, your words of power stop working on it. So like single target damage, single target crit, like those words of powers just don't work on Merciful Shot anymore, which makes its damage a lot lower than it should be. So since it's bugged like that, we tend to not really prioritize it in a build. And so we usually do not trait here. Until that basically it's fixed, it's just not worth putting in points to buff Merciful Shot. So we just gonna ignore this one. The next skill over is Rain of Arrows, which Rain of Arrows is, at this point, it's basically a bread and butter skill for hunters. It's your main AoE skill, and it is added upon by the current set bonus for red hunters with this current raid. So the first point gets you the skill and then adds a bit of crit chance, crit multiplier. Second point gives more crit chance and more crit multiplier. So we're going to get both of those definitely. Even in a single target build, we'll still get both of those ranks. Just because with the bleed that is added by the current set bonus, it's still worth picking this up in single target, and if you're going to pick it up, you might as well get the extra crit chance and crit multiplier with it. So I'll talk a bit more about Rain of Arrows with the set bonus later, but for now, that's definitely something you always want to pick up. Next is Quick Draw. I talked a little bit about this earlier. It's just flat skill induction buff here, so it just makes all your induction skills a little bit faster. It's very good, 5.5% per rank, which makes it better than the subsequent ranks of Fast Draw, which is just 3% per rank. And also, one thing to note is that this is all skill inductions, which is technically different from bow inductions like Fast Draw does. Just the way that it interacts with and stacks with other induction buffs. So like things that are all skill inductions, the buffs will add with each other. So if you have like all skill inductions from this and, for instance, a warden uses adroit maneuver that also buffs skill inductions, they will stack with each other. So with this plus the warden buff, that's a 40% skill induction reduction. What this does is whatever that induction ends up at, this one's multiplicative with it. So if you have this fully stacked up, it'd be a 30% bow reduction. Whatever your inductions are after these all skill inductions, it'll take another 30% off of that, if that makes sense. So say that your inductions are sitting at, 100%. You use Quick Draw. You have this traded. That gets it down to 80. So of that 80% that's left, Fast Draw would just shave 30% of the 80%, which quick math in my head is not great at calculating, but it wouldn't make it go down to 50%. It would be somewhere around like 60 something at that point. So that makes Fast Draw intrinsically weaker than Quick Draw just because of the way that interaction works. But in general, we still pick up both of them at max level, just because we have enough trait points to do so. But that is something to keep in mind. There aren't, I'm as far as I'm aware, fast draw is the only quote unquote bow induction reduction that you have that works like that. I think all the other inductions that you get from traceries and other things like that are like part of this all skill inductions instead. So basically everything will just add with each other to reduce them, except for fast draw, which just like kind of multiplies with that like remainder that's left over. Either way, quick draw, really good. Always pick it up. Next is our biggest hunter cooldown. This is the biggest damage cooldown booster that you have, Burn Hot. So Burn Hot, it increases your range damage and it reduces power costs. At this point, power costs aren't a huge deal, just with regen food and fate being as high as it is and whatnot. But just the damage increase is pretty big. The second rank just reduces its cooldown and buffs the other effects of it, the damage and the power cost reduction. So we always want 2 ranks of Burn Hot. Burn Hot is a very strong skill, and it gets even better with the tracery, which I'll talk about in a bit when we go over LIs. But yeah, Burn Hot, you always trait that. All right, moving on down, we got Bodkin Arrows, which is a mitigation bypass. So all this does, it makes it so if an enemy has, say, like 40% mitigations, if you trait this, then you're getting through 10% of it for free. That's basically what it does. So it's always good to have. In a raid scenario, a lot of times you're getting enemies pretty low mitigations anyways from debuffs from like the LM, or like the champ has a bit of reduction as well, that kind of thing. So you're getting pretty low induction or mitigations anyways, so this just kind of helps you get that down to 0 a lot easier. So we always want to trait Bodkin Arrows. Next over, this one's actually pretty important, Deadly Precision. So this makes it so that every time that you crit with a skill, you generate 1 focus. For focus generation in combat, this one is very important. You definitely notice a big difference between having it and not having it. And when you have this trait, you don't tend to worry a ton about focus. Usually when you want to use a skill, you have the focus to use it, or you just need to use 1 or 2 quick shots to get enough focus. This one's pretty big. And we always want to trait that. Next, this is Hail of Arrows. Hail of Arrows makes Rain of Arrows cooldown reduce. So every time you crit on a target with Rain of Arrows, this trait makes the cooldown lower. And that if you crit enough with it on enough targets, you can reduce the cooldown all the way to 0. So you can just use Rain of Arrows again. The first rank makes that have like a 50% proc chance with crits, but the second rank makes 100%. So that with 2 ranks in this, every time you crit, it reduces the cooldown of Rain of Arrows. So in an AoE build, this is critical. Like if you're ever in a fight where there's any sort of, cloud of mobs or multiple mobs that you're trying to hit, if you ever have multiple targets, you basically always want to have this traded. In a single target, you don't really care too much about this, especially because right now, single target likes Rain of Arrows because of the bleed that's on it, and the bleed is the same duration as the cooldown of the skill, so you don't need to reduce it at all. But in an AoE environment, this trait is very big. It's very critical. When there's enough targets, you can sit there and just spam it over and over and over, and your DPS just skyrockets, kind of like a yellow champ in the middle of a bunch of ads. So this one, very strong, very good. You always want to trade it in an AoE build. All right, now to the capstones. So the first capstone here is Upshot. Upshot is one of your biggest hitting skills along with Heartseeker. So Upshot does more damage the more focus you have, and it uses all of your focus. So generally with Upshot, you want to make sure you're at full focus when you use it, because the damage drop off from being at like 8 focus instead of 9 focus, which 9 focus is max, is fairly significant. So in general, if Upshot's off cooldown but you're not at full focus, just use a quick shot or so just to get that focus capped off before using the Upshot. The slight time delay in using it is usually worth the damage that you gain from being at max focus. So upshot, we always trait that in red for sure. All right, the last trait in red is plant feet. It makes it so that if you stand still for at least a second and a half, you gain a 5% evade chance. This trait is really bad, and you basically never want to use it. So 5% evade chance on a hunter as a DPS class that is not usually having aggro of ads in the first place, if your tanks are doing their jobs correctly, it is basically a wasted trait. You never can really gain the full benefits out of it. And also, 5% evade chance on a class that's not building, block, parry, and evade is fairly weak, since those kind of, the way they interact with each other, the more you have of each of them, the more potent they get. But, so yeah, plant feet, just, you don't really want to use that much. It might be okay in PvP. I am not a huge PvP hunter, so I can't fully speak on that, but in general, you don't want to waste the trait points on plant feet. So that is all you want to use in red in a general trait tree. I also, when I say a general trait tree, I usually count that as AoE in getting Hail of Arrows, because if you're landscaping or doing 3 or 6 mans, in most scenarios you have more than one enemy that you're fighting. So in general, AoE is kind of nice. So before we move over to blue line traits, I quickly want to go through the red line passives that you get while you're in red and have enough points traded. Some of them are pretty simple, like this first one. It just reduces the induction of barbed arrow and swift bow. So it's just 2 of your induction skills that you're using. They just get slightly faster to cast because of this passive. Shoot to kill, another one. This is 10% range damage. This one is mastery, not base damage. So to quickly explain that, mastery versus base damage. So mastery, you have a mastery rating that equates to a percent. And then if you have percent mastery bonuses, they go on top of your current mastery rating. So if you look at this tooltip right now, it'll show that my melee mastery is 191.9%. So that is the amount of mastery I am getting from my current mastery rating. But if you notice, the ranged mastery is 10% higher than that. And that 10% is from this trait here, this 10% range damage trait. So percent mastery bonuses and a lot of buffs in the game that say damage, like if you have like a 10% damage boost, are usually talking about mastery. For instance, like Guardians have break ranks, which is a 40% damage boost. That is 40% mastery. So with break ranks, I would be at 240% mastery right now. That kind of thing. So there's usually, you want to get your mastery rating as high as possible, and then percent damage boosts go on top of that. Because with rating, you cap out at 200%. Versus things like that affect base damage, affect the actual intrinsic base damage of your skills, and then get further multiplied by mastery. So base damage is much stronger than mastery, which is why things like that's another reason why Elf Hunters are so good, is because this is a 5% base damage boost rather than a mastery boost. Yeah, so that is what this skill does. It just adds 10% mastery to your range skills. Archer's Mark. So this is a fairly recent change. It was a couple months back they added this. Basically, every range skill you use, like every attack, has a chance to apply a debuff. It used to be crit defense. Now it is incoming damage. It stacks up to, I believe, like 2%, 1.5%, 2%. I haven't checked it in a while, but it's one of those things that you don't need to care about because it will almost always be there. You're using enough skills quickly enough that even with only a 20% chance to apply it, it's almost always there and fully stacked, and you don't have to pay attention to it. But it is nice, nice little handy bump that helps everyone, not just you, because it puts that as a debuff on the target. Next one, Hemorrhaging Shot. So Hemorrhaging Shot just makes your crit damage higher. So that's another way to put that, is your crit magnitude is higher. So when an attack crits, it does 10% more damage. than the base crit damage is already doing. So it's another, it's a nice boost, makes your crits crit harder. Swift Mercy. So I talked a little bit about this earlier when talking about Merciful Shot. So Swift Mercy makes it so that you can use Merciful Shot at 70% health instead of 50, because by default you can only use Merciful Shot when the target is at 50% health. So in red you can use it at 70%, and then this also makes it so that every time you use Swift Bow, the focus cost of Merciful Shot is reduced by 1 focus. So Merciful Shot by default, I believe, is 6 focus. Yep, 6 focus. So if you use 6 Swift Bows before you use Merciful Shot, then it will be a free cast. It won't cost any focus. Now, this is kind of what breaks Merciful Shot currently and makes it not worth using, is because as soon as you use Swift Bow even once to reduce that focus 1 time, the way the back end work, it changes the skill and it no longer applies your Word of Power traceries to it. So that's kind of why this is broken a bit. But, I mean, it's not really worth not using Swift Bow in order to get a fully powered Merciful Shot. The Swift Bow itself will do a lot more damage, especially over time, because the cooldown of Merciful Shot is 30 seconds, so it's not a super frequent skill. But anyways, that's what Swift Mercy does, is it increases that health threshold so you can use it at 70%, and then it reduces the focus cost by 1 every time you use Swift Bow. Next passive is a fairly important one, especially for your opening combo on a hunter. So Camouflage is a stealth skill you have that when you can be stealthed while standing still. This passive makes it so that the stealth is better, and then also you have a 50% crit chance with range skills while camouflaged. That's pretty big. So that makes it so that if you sit there using camouflage, you already have a plus 50% chance to crit. So that is on top of the crit chance you already have, which is going to be around 30 to 33% usually, fully capped. So you're already sitting like a 80% or higher from stealth when you use this. You have another skill that can increase that even further, that basically then makes your first shot from camouflage guaranteed to crit. So that's a very strong skill, and makes it so that's why if you see a hunter starting combat and they go stealth to start, this is why, is so you get that big extra crit chance. Your last one here, Marksman. So this is one of the reasons why precision stance is better than strength. So every time that you get a crit or devastating hit, you reduce the cooldown of Upshot and Heartseeker. So a crit reduces them by 1 second, a devastate reduces them by 2 seconds. So that is pretty big. That makes it so that the more you crit, the more damage you can do, just because you can use more Heartseekers and more Upshots. So that's pretty massive. And in precision stance, your quick shot has a vastly increased crit chance. So then you're critting way more with quick shot. Quick shot is your spam skill, your most used skill. So that translates to a very big cooldown reduction for Upshot and Heartseeker. So this one's pretty huge and contributes strongly to why precision stance is usually out DPSing strength. So those are the red line passives that you get while being in red line. Some of them are pretty strong, which helps contribute to why red line just does more damage than the other specs. But yeah, so from here, we're going to trait a bit into blue now. So first in blue, impact.
One note on Marksman, it's the remaining cooldown if your Heartseeker and Upshot is currently on cooldown. It's not for the next shot.
Indeed, yes.
Which is actually a little bit weird if you think about it.
Yeah, so it's when you use the skill and the skill is on cooldown, if you get a crit or a dev, it shortens that active cooldown. So that lets you get the skill up sooner. Yes, thanks for pointing that out. So in blue, we got Impact Arrow's first one. This is range damage. This is Mastery, like I talked about before. It just is a 5% Mastery increase. So it's not huge, but, it's helpful. And we have to trait down into blue to unlock other traits anyways, so we almost always use our points in there. Strong draw. So this one's a bit weird and catches some hunters off guard, and just the fact that we don't fully trait this one, but we partially trait it. So if you look at the tooltip, it adds 5% damage for focus skills. So skills that use focus are like pen shot and blood arrow and whatnot, and so this adds damage to those skills. If you look at rank 5 versus rank 6, rank 5 is 25% damage boost. Rank 6 is still just a 25% damage boost. It just adds the effect that using a focus skill has a 15% chance to reduce the focus cost of all skills by 1. That is not a huge buff, and doesn't proc super often either, especially since focus is not usually a big problem that hunters are running into. So we usually will just put 5 points into this one to get that full damage boost, but we don't want to waste 2 trait points to get that small effect proc chance skill at the 6th rank. So we just put 5 in strong draw. Next, we got Press Onward. So Press Onward is your biggest self-heal that you have on Hunter. It's also the only skill you have that counts as a healing skill, which affects some stuff like triggers, trigger essences, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But Press Onward, especially with the current raid and then raid environment, is really strong. I always recommend putting at least 1 point into this first skill anyways, especially even like in a landscape build, or if you're doing like 3-mans, 6-mans, whatever. Having a heal like that is pretty helpful, especially because it's a fairly fast animation. So it's very quick to get it off and get that kind of burst heal. It also gets further improved by traceries, which I'll talk about in a bit. Next, we have Quick Shot Focus. So this makes it so that every time that you use Quick Shot, there's a chance for it to generate 2 focus instead of 1 focus. And if you crit with it, since we talked about earlier, with this skill, crits can generate focus. So that means if you crit with a Quick Shot and get this, you could get 3 focus off of 1 Quick Shot. So this is pretty good. However, we don't fully trade it because we don't really have the points to spare. There are some other traits that we want to put those points in instead. So we'll trait this enough to get down to the next row, which will just be, we'll put 3 points in here because the next skill is Split Shot, which we will put a point in. So Split Shot is another AoE skill. It does 4 targets by default, but it also just hits really hard on its own. Like as a single target skill, Split Shot's pretty good. And it crits pretty hard as well. So we put 1 point into that. Even in an AoE build, we don't usually put the extra points in for the max targets. Reason for that is mainly just because it's a lot more expensive to get those max targets, and we can better spend those points elsewhere. And also, in an AoE build, the vast majority of your AoE damage is going to come from Rain of Arrows anyways. So Split Shot is definitely good and should be used off cooldown in an AoE environment, but we don't usually want to spend the points on the extra targets just because other things have more priority. So next we got Perseverance. This just buffs Press Onward. So at max rank, it adds another 10% to the Press Onward heal. Situationally, this is really strong and really good. In a general build, like when I'm trading here, you don't usually end up trading that. Just because it's good to trait this first one because all you are giving up to trait this is like 4% of that Quick Shot. Instead of putting a point in there, you put the point here, and then getting that heal is well worth it. But unless you're in a situation where you really, really are prioritizing your own survival and self-heals, this one isn't really worth trading. I'll talk about it a bit later, though, in which situations I would trade it. Next is Pathfinder. So Pathfinder just adds a buff, or it buffs the movement speed of Find the Path. So Find the Path is a out of combat run speed skill, 15%. If you fully trait the Pathfinder trait, it makes it double that, so you go up to 30%. I almost never trait that, just because it doesn't affect combat or damage. In a landscape build, it can be worth trading just to get around faster. Especially in landscape, you're killing a lot of things in 1 or 2 shots anyways, so you could give up bleed damage or something like that to get Pathfinder instead. But in any sort of build for instances or like even daily stuff like that, I never want to waste the points on Pathfinder that I could instead use to get more damage for my skills. Next is improved intent concentration. It just reduces the cooldown on intent concentration, adds a power restore. Intent concentration is a skill that has a 3-minute cooldown that you can use to instantly get full focus. It's not super useful. It is very situationally useful. For instance, if you're in the middle of combat and you die and you get rezzed and you're just trying to get your rotation going really quickly, this can be really good to pop and instantly get full focus. However, since it's such a rare situational skill and doesn't add anything to your damage, you almost never want to actually use this trait for it. So we're going to leave that one empty. So next we have Blood Arrow. So Blood Arrow is a skill you already have. It's your corruption removal, which is an important note for it. And also it does a 10% morale restore. So it heals you for 10% of your morale, which is pretty strong. So what this trait does to it is it adds a heal over time as well. So the first rank gives it a 5% morale heal over time, and that is that it heals 5% of your morale over the entire duration of the hot. Not that it's not every tick does 5%. And then the second rank makes that 10% and reduces the cooldown of the skill by 5 seconds, which is really good. So we're gonna get both of those, but also in addition to just making Blood Arrow better, it unlocks this one, Exsanguinate. So Exsanguinate is another one of your big bleed skills. So you can use Exsanguinate when you use Blood Arrow. So using Blood Arrow unlocks the use of Exsanguinate. So 1 point in here earns you the skill, but right now it only has a chance to use it when you use Blood Arrow. Putting all the points in here makes it so that every time you use Blood Arrow, you're guaranteed the chance to use Exsanguinate. Exsanguinate is a fairly powerful bleed, so we always want to use that here. Also, another quick note is before some LI changes, you might have heard some hunters that were running light damage on their LIs to improve light damage. Is because Exsanguinate, regardless of whatever oils or anything you're using, always does light damage. As you can see in that tooltip there, it says that it is light range damage, and then that the damage over time is also light damage. So that was basically improving Exsanguinate. Also, with light oils on, light damage affect barbed arrow, but that's just kind of a interesting way that Exsanguinate ended up working. Hunters aren't really trading that anymore because LIs kind of changed a bit, and we just don't have room for that. But we'll talk about LIs more in a bit. All right, so now we're going to take a bit of a break from blue, and we have 12 trait points left. So in non-red skills, that would give us 6 more ranks we can get in things. So in this generic trait tree, there are 2 ways you can kind of go with it. You can either get bleed damage or you can get mitigations. So what we're going to look at is in the yellow line, we have natural extracts. So natural extracts adds 5% damage to your damage over time skills, and this is in the form of a mastery increase. So it just makes your damage over time skills, which you have several of, including Heartseeker and Barbed Arrow and Exsanguinate, and with the set bonus, Rain of Arrows as well. This just makes them better, so it makes them do more damage. So this is 5% per rank. In blue, the next tier we're looking at would have been Barbed Fury, which is the exact same thing, except that it's 4% per rank. So Barbed Fury and Natural Extracts are the same, except that Natural Extracts gets an extra % per rank, which makes this one the better one to put points in. Your other option to use these points would be Survival Gear, which Survival Gear just gives you mitigations. Mitigations work similar to the way that I was talking about Mastery before, where you have rating that gets it like to a certain amount, and then percentage goes over that rating, so you can get over capped with percentage buffs. And so that's what this does, is it increases your mitigations by percentage buffs that can go over cap. So if you're in a situation where you are prioritizing your survival, or if you're struggling to survive, it can often be way better to trait survival gear instead of the extra bleed damage. So for this generic build, I would say trading survival gear can be your best bet. But if you know that you are with a group or landscaping or somewhere where you don't need the extra survivability, then trading 5 points into natural extracts and then 1 point into Barb Fury can also be good. Now, before we wrap up with this trait tree, a couple more traits I just kind of want to talk about that you could get, but I wouldn't recommend getting them, are things like Tripwire here. So you can get that for 2 points. It just puts down a trap, a ground-placed trap that is a 5-second knockdown to a target. Which can sometimes it works similar to like an FM with that the way the knockdown works, so it can stack with things like stuns and dazes. In almost every situation though, a hunter doesn't really want that, except for maybe like a PvP or specific like landscape build. If you're struggling with landscape to kill things fast enough, you can use this to kind of control your targets a bit. But in general, it doesn't add much to your damage, or doesn't add anything to your damage. And takes a long time to use, long induction and a long animation, so we don't really want to use Tripwire. Another option that we could have had is Shot Through the Heart here. So like we have enough points to get to this tier. So like if you went the route to get natural extracts, you could put 5 points in there and have 1 point left over. You could get Shot Through the Heart. So what Shot Through the Heart does is it makes it so that if your target has a bleed on it, it makes Heartseeker and Merciful Shot proc a little bit extra damage. So there's been some testing done previously. The extra damage that Shot Through the Heart does is very small, to the point where you can argue that even on a single target, it can be better to just have 4% more bleed damage. Might out DPS Shot Through the Heart. It's pretty close though. However, with the big thing this cap, especially with AoE being so prevalent on a hunter, is that in an AoE fight with Rain of Arrows and the bleed that the set bonus gives to Rain of Arrows, is that this then way out DPS's Shot Through the Heart. So usually if you have the option, you're usually getting a rank in Barb Fury instead of Shot Through the Heart. There are also skills you can get like Strength of the Earth, which Strength of the Earth is a power restore. Not good. It takes a long time. It's a channeled skill. That I think it's a long channel. Yeah, like a 5-second channel. That just restores a little bit of power. Super, super not worth it. You can add a morale restore to it as well, but it still just isn't worth using in any line, I don't think. There's also volley that you could potentially put 1 point into, and volley just makes a very small chance at 1 rank is 3% of focus skills causing your next induction skill to be free. It makes your next induction instant. Kind of nice, but also barely procs and is not really worth it over just getting some more bleed damage, in my opinion. Because with the way that the current game works, your inductions are usually pretty fast, especially if there's a warden in your group. So this is kind of what I would use as a generic trait tree. Alternatively, you could take the points out of survival gear and put them into bleed damage like that. So this is the kind of way you want to go. So next, I'm going to quickly just talk about some more specific trait trees that I use for certain fights that can be a bit different from the regular trait tree, but worth it for those fights. So first off, something that you might use for like a single target trait tree, especially if it's like a single target fight, you're not taking much damage, that kind of thing, is you would take the points out of the Rain of Arrows reset, because single target, you don't care about that skill being reset. You're just using it off cooldown for the bleed on it. Instead, you can take that and put it into more bleed damage. Another thing is we might put 1 point into quick shot focus and take out the press onwards. If we don't need press onwards in a fight, you can greed slightly more damage and get 4% chance for more focus on quick shot. So something like this might be my single target trait tree if I'm not worried about the damage I'm taking. one last tree I'll talk about is the tree that I usually use for fights like boss 3 of Hidden Horde in the higher tiers and stuff like that, where just fights where your survival is really important and you're typically taking a lot of damage. So for a fight like that, instead of the bleed damage, you get survival gear like I talked about, just to become more tanky. But also, we want to get these extra points in perseverance so that your press onwards is healing you for a lot more. So to get those, we're usually sacrificing the points from quick shot focus to get that. So you can get a trait tree that's somewhat like this to just be a bit extra tanky. Now, something that I've done as well is if I really want to, greed some bleed damage or something, you can sacrifice some points from fast draw and, get 2 ranks of natural extracts by sacrificing 4 points of fast draw. But I mean, that's not super worth it. Usually, though, what I'll do is I'll take 2 points out of that just to go and get these reset points here. So this is actually the trait tree that I use for boss 3 of Hidden Horde in the higher tiers. So you have your reset for your AoE damage, you got your mitts from survival gear, and then you got extra healing from perseverance. So you're giving up a bit of focus generation from this trait, but it doesn't. This is more of a nice to have because it doesn't really affect your rotation in any meaningful way. At most, you might have to use an extra quick shot here and there before you being able to use a skill. But with how fast your rotation is going anyways, it's not a huge deal. So yeah, so that's it for the trait trees and kind of what I would focus on using there. I'll just keep this one on, and then next I'm going to talk about some of the skills, the specific skills that you have on a hunter. So I'm just kind of going to go down the line of damage skills first here. So your very first skill in one of your main skills here is Quick Shot. Quick Shot is a no cooldown skill, very fast induction. It stacks up that fast draw buff I talked about that increases your inductions even more. So you are spamming the skill between all of your other skills. This is your filler. So basically, if you're not using other skills, this is the one you're using. And you are using this generally between every skill or between every 2 skills just to keep your fast draw buff up, because the fast draw buff is a fairly short duration. Next is Pen Shot. So Penetrating Shot is your biggest debuff skill. So this lowers the mitigations of your target by 4%. And then also because of that trait that we talked about earlier in red, this the very first one here, it adds on 10% incoming ranged crit chance. So if you are sitting at 30% crit chance against something, just based off of your stats, if you use the skill now against that target, you have 40% crit chance. So this is a very, very strong skill. It has a 10-second duration with a 1-second cooldown, so it is incredibly easy to keep this debuff up at all times. But Pen Shot itself doesn't do a ton of damage, so you're really using the skill for that debuff rather than for damage on its own. So you're using it about once every 10 seconds. Next focus skill here is Upshot that I have. So Upshot, this is one of your biggest heavy hitters. You want to use it at full focus, at 9 focus, and then it uses all 9 focus as well. There's not much to it. It's the cooldown, its active cooldown, I should say, gets reduced by Quick Shot. So when the skill is on cooldown and you get crits, well, actually not just Quick Shot, but with anything, if you get crits or devastating hits, it reduces the cooldown. But you mostly take advantage of that with Quick Shot spam, because Quick Shot crits a lot more often than your other range skills. The next one I have here is Split Shot. Split Shot is it's an AoE skill, but it's also a very strong single target skill, just because it does a lot of its own damage. So this one is a skill that you're using fairly frequently, but it kind of gets other skills prioritized ahead of that, which when I talk about rotation, I'll kind of talk about your skill priority then. Yeah, it's another induction skill for that. Next is Blood Arrow. So Blood Arrow, talked a bit about it before. It lets you use Exsanguinate, the bleed skill, and it also does heals. So with that fully traded, this skill will heal 20% of your max morale. So 10% up front with another 2% over like every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. So it does another 10% after. But more importantly as well, especially with the current raid, is it's your main corruption removal skill, and it can remove up to 3 different corruption stacks. So the way that with that works is if there is one corruption on the target, but that corruption has like tiers to it, it will only remove one tier of it. But if that target has multiple corruptions built up, this can remove up to 3 of them. So this is very strong corruption removal. It's a very strong self-heal. It's your second self-heal that you like to use after press onwards. But it's also a part of your rotation since it unlocks Exsanguinate, which is one of your biggest bleed skills. Next on the line here, I have Rain of Arrows. Rain of Arrows, main AoE skill. This is the skill you're trying to spam the most to do AoE damage, but it also is really good for single target damage because of a current set bonus. So if you look at that tooltip, it has its main damage, but then it has a damage over time listed underneath that. The damage over time is only available with the current Hunter set bonus. For instance, if I take off a piece of my red gear here, then if I look at that tooltip again, it loses that dot. So that's just something for this level cap. But because of that dot, it becomes a very strong AoE and single target skill. So that one is one that you're using off cooldown a lot of the times. Next, we have Merciful Shot. So Merciful Shot, this skill is one that it still gets used, but is definitely not one of your most important skills just because of the way that its damage is sort of crippled at the moment because of its poor interaction with allies. But yeah, Merciful Shot, it can only be used when a target is at 70% health or less. And that is in red just because of this makes that threshold 70. If you're not in red, that threshold's 50%. But yeah, so that's it's another focus skill, and it costs 6 by default, but gets reduced by Swiftbow. And yeah, not a hugely important skill to be using. Just to continue with some of the other important range skills, I'm going to go up here and talk about Blindside next. So Blindside is a skill that does a lot of damage. But the most important thing is the fact that it is your induction or your interrupt skill. Sorry. So it is your interrupt, which interrupts enemy inductions, but also is your animation cancel for your own skills. Since if you look at that tooltip, it is immediate. So immediate skills are used as animation cancels. Hunters have a couple longer animations that you're usually using Blindside to cancel, unless you're in an instance where you need to save it to actually interrupt a target. So just to kind of go over, there's like 3 skills that you'll tend to use this with, and what I tend to do is I'll use it with whatever skill that its cooldown lines up with. So it's an 18-second cooldown, so it's a kind of longer cooldown, but whenever Blindside is up, the next skill I use as a long animation I'll cancel with it. Those skills include things like Swiftbow. So Swiftbow does 3 hits after an induction, but that animation to do those 3 hits is kind of long, so that's why you can cancel it with Blindside. You just have to be careful that you don't use Blindside too early, because you can accidentally cancel the induction, and in which case Swiftbow doesn't go off at all. So you have to make sure you wait for the induction to finish, then you can cancel it with Blindside. Other one would be Split Shot. Has a longer animation than a lot of your other skills. So that is another one that can be good to cancel. And it also has an induction, though, so you have to make sure that the induction gets off first before canceling. The last one I use to cancel is Rain of Arrows. So Rain of Arrows has an animation where you shoot arrows up into the sky, which can also be a bit longer, and so I might cancel that with Blindside. So whichever of these 3 skills I'm using next when Blindside's off cooldown, I'll just use Blindside with those skills. I don't save it specifically for one skill. But sometimes if you're in a fight where you need to interrupt a target, you're not going to be animation canceling at all, because you're going to actually save the interrupt to do an interrupt. Yes, you had something?
Yeah, when you're learning the rhythm for when you can use Blindside, look for the green square around your skill. As soon as it turns green, the induction is done, and you can use Blindside.
Yeah, I usually just tend to watch the induction bar as well. This is because once the induction bar fully finishes, fully fills up, then you should be free to use the animation cancel. And that's kind of the case for any animation cancel class. Like if you're trying to cancel any sort of induction animation, then you gotta just kind of get used to waiting for that induction to finish before doing the actual cancel. And I'll kind of go over that a bit more when I'm going through the rotation later. Next skill, Barbed Arrow. Barbed Arrow is a bleed and run speed debuff. In most PvE situations, the run speed debuff is kind of secondary, especially since you're in red and you're not moving a ton anyways. In like a instance or a raid, usually it's useless because a lot of targets are immune to run speed debuffs, like bosses and whatnot. So the main reason you're using it is for the bleed on it, which it has a 12-second bleed. And it doesn't stack with itself, it just refreshes itself. So you're basically just trying to use Barbed Arrow once every 12 seconds. Just kind of like pen shot using once every 10 seconds. And I'll kind of go over in a bit different ways you can track that. There's a lot of useful plugins and whatnot you can use to handle that timing a lot easier. Yes, this is just one of your main bleed skills. Next, Heartseeker. This is one of your biggest, heaviest hitting skills. So Heartseeker and Upshot are usually your two priority skills. So its upfront damage is much higher than basically anything else, and it can't be missed, parried, evaded, or blocked, which is pretty strong in a fight where that if you have low finesse or if the enemy has some buff on them that gives them BPE, something like that. And in PvP, obviously, it can't miss. So Heartseeker is really strong, and it also has your strongest bleed of all your bleed skills on it. So this one is definitely used off cooldown. It's another one that its cooldown gets reduced by quickshot. So when it's on cooldown, its active cooldown gets reduced every time you get crits or devs with any skill, but mostly quickshot is what ends up influencing that. So while it has a 50-second cooldown, you're usually using it way more often than once every 50 seconds. Next is Swiftbow. Talked a bit about that before. Does three shots. It has an induction followed by a fairly lengthy animation. And it reduces the cost of Merciful Shot every time you use it. Swiftbow is another fairly heavy hitting skill, and is usually up there in your rotation priority as a result. It also generates 2 focus, which is nice, and then it generates additional focus for crits because of that one trait we talked about earlier. Like when you crit, you generate extra focus from Deadly Precision. So this skill has the chance to give you a ton of focus, which is really nice to use after something like Upshot, which drains all your focus. Also, you can get procs for an insta-cast Swiftbow to get rid of the induction completely from Quickshot. So every time you use Quickshot, you have a chance from this trait here you have a 20% chance to reduce that induction to 0. And that buff you get lasts 10 seconds. So you're fairly often going to get insta-cast Swiftbows just because of how often you're spamming Quickshot. You get those procs fairly regularly. So that, and they're pretty nice to use in conjunction right after an Upshot. So you can just Upshot Swiftbow and you're already back up to decent focus. Even if you cut the Swiftbow with Blindside, which gives you another 3 focus, then you're almost at max focus already. I'll talk a bit more about that later with the rotation, but that's sort of the gist with Swiftbow. And then your last main ranged skill is Exsanguinate. It's just a bleed. You can use Exsanguinate after using Blood Arrow, and it's a fairly strong bleed, and you usually want to be using this as much as you can. When you use Blood Arrow, the window to use Exsanguinate isn't super long. I don't actually remember off the top of my head the duration of that. I think it's like 8 seconds. Yeah, looks like it's 8 seconds. So after Blood Arrow, you have an 8-second window to use Exsanguinate, and you usually want to make sure you do. Missing one can be a pretty decent DPS loss, especially if like your parsing can feel that. So those are your main range skills that you're using. Some of the damage skills you have that you don't really use much are things like low cut. You almost never use low cut. It has a long animation. It does low damage. In PvE, it's just never really worth doing. It does a run speed debuff, but run speed debuffs aren't hugely important in PvE, especially when you have to be in melee range to use it. It can be nice in conjunction with this trait if you're in PvP or something like that, but in general, you're not really using low cut. Set trap, also not really using that much. In Redline, it doesn't really do much. Like it's more like if you're standing around waiting for like a fight to start, you can sometimes throw it down, but like it's almost never worth using. In Yellow Line, it can be pretty strong because it has an incoming damage debuff, but in Red Line, we're never really touching the skill. Bard's Arrow. So Bard's Arrow is a fear. It does okay damage on its own, but you'd mainly use this as the fear for CC. Situationally, it can be useful. For instance, if you need to interrupt a target that is fearable, but you don't have blindside up, this can be a pretty good option because the fear will typically interrupt inductions, including gray bar inductions, if the target can be feared. However, most of the time you're not using the skill much past those sort of weird situational moments, just because as a red hunter, you're DPS focused. So even if there's targets that are useful to be CC'd, that's not usually your job unless your raid leader's like, hey, can you throw Bard's Arrow at whatever? So in general, the skill goes fairly unused. Similarly is Distracting Shot. So Distracting Shot is a 10-second daze, but the skill itself is a 3-minute cooldown. So it can similarly be used as sort of a pseudo interrupt on targets, but it's with its super long cooldown, it's not like a super reliable CC to kind of keep up anything, and it doesn't do any damage on its own, so it's really not used very often. But again, similarly to Bard's Arrow, it can be situationally useful on certain targets, but for the most part, you can ignore it. Pinning Shot. So Pinning Shot does a little bit of its own damage. It's a root, so you can get a root on for 5 seconds on a target. There's not many targets where this is super useful for. The most that you might use it is if like the tank loses aggro of something that's running at you. You can give the tank a couple extra seconds to pick it back up before it reaches you and hits you, if it's a target that can be rooted. But in general, it's another CC skill that is very situational, and you almost never want to be using it. It's definitely not part of your rotation by any stretch of the imagination. The last damaging skill, that's another sort of situational one, is Dazing Blow. So Dazing Blow does a 5-second daze, and a little bit of damage, but almost none, because it's a melee skill, and your melee skills don't hit very hard. But the most important part of Dazing Blow is it's a corruption removal. So it removes corruptions the exact same way that Blood Arrow does, where it can remove up to 3 separate corruption buffs, but only one tier of them. So if you're trying to hit a target, it has corruptions up that need to be down. Your Blood Arrow's on cooldown. This is an excellent option if you're within melee range of it to just wipe the corruptions off. It also has sort of a longer animation, so it's still like the only real reason to use Dazing Blow is as a corruption removal. And then sometimes you might use it as a daze if there's a target on you that can be dazed and you need to get away from it. Give yourself some space for like a tank to pick it up or something. You can use Dazing Blow to buy you some time. Or if you're in landscape or something like that, you can similarly use it to make space between you and your opponent. Or as an interrupt, because the daze can be used as a pseudo interrupt similar to your other CC skills, but by and large this is a corruption removal skill, and that's the most that you'll be using it for. All right, so those are all sort of your damage skills and kind of what they do. Next, I'm going to kind of go over your buff skills and the sort of situations that you use them. Your main buff is Burn Hot. So Burn Hot with the Tracer, you can get up to 78.5% range damage, which is pretty big. So that, and it's on a 1.5-minute cooldown. So as far as DPS buffs go, that's a pretty good one, pretty short one. And most recently, with the Minstrel rework, Call to Greatness resets the cooldown to Burn Hot, which it makes it even better because you can use it basically twice in a row every so often. So Burn Hot is what you're using for any big DPS burn phases, stuff like that. In longer fights, a lot of the times, unless you know exactly when to use it, you can just use it off cooldown. Because it's a minute and a half, it tends to line up with some other buffs. Like for red captains have Oathbreaker's Shame, also known as Oathies, which that is on a 3-minute cooldown. So if you're using Burn Hot off cooldown, every other Burn Hot will line up with Oathies, which is pretty good. And there's a lot of other skills that are either on 1 minute or minute and a half or 3-minute timers like that. So in something like a single target fight where you're just sitting still, shooting one target, debuffs are going on it, you're usually using Burn Hot off cooldown. You're not saving it for anything because it will naturally line up with other buffs. Yeah, so that's Burn Hot. That's your biggest DPS skill. Next is Improved Focus. So Improved Focus is a pretty important skill, especially for your opening burst. So what it does is, in addition to it generates focus over the duration of its channel, so you can get full focus before a fight, but also it gives you this buff here, this Improved Focus buff, which is 25% range crit chance and crit multiplier. So it makes your crits hit harder. But the most important thing is that crit chance, because it stacks with your current crit chance and with the next skill, Camouflage is crit chance. So if you're in Camouflage, that gives you a buff that is a 50% crit chance buff. If you use Focus, that gives you another 25, which gives you 75, and then you have your inherent crit chance, which then if you see that tooltip there, that ranged crit hit, if I use Focus, watch that, that'll be 107% range crit chance. So it's guaranteeing your first crit out of stealth when you stack these together. So that's why in a fight, when you start, this is usually the kind of stance you're in, is you're sitting there in stealth and using Focus right before. And then you usually open up with like a Heartseeker and then get an auto crit Heartseeker instantly, which is, very strong. Also, this Improved Focus buff lasts a couple seconds after. It's like a 5-second duration after the end of Focus, which you can usually animation cancel it. Or not animation cancel, just skill cancel it by either hitting the button for it or clicking it again. So you can cancel it halfway through, although it looks like I'm lagging kind of bad right now, so it's hard to demonstrate. So that's when I talk about opening combos, something that I'll be using a lot is using and canceling the skill just to get this buff, this Improved Focus buff. Yep, and so we talked a bit about Camouflage. Next is Beneath Notice. So Beneath Notice is a skill that lowers your perceived threat. So threat is kind of a weird system, but the way that this works is perceived threat doesn't actually like reset the threat you have against an enemy to 0. It just reduces it temporarily during the duration of that buff. So that is I mostly use it if a tank dies or is losing aggro on something or something like that in a raid. I'll hit Beneath Notice, and then the target will then eat another DPS instead of me. So that tends to be the main place to use it. Also, I'll sometimes use it preemptively in something like a big AoE pull. And if you have maybe a single tank, and then if it's like a captain tank or something, they're going to struggle with aggro for a bit. So at the beginning of the pull, I'll actually hit Beneath Notice really early on and then start a bunch of AoE damage. And then that way the tank doesn't need to taunt for a bit because my perceived threat will be basically 0 at that point compared to the tank, which will at least have a little bit. So for 10 seconds, I can just be doing a ton of damage for free. And then when the tank taunts, it will still copy that threat because it's not my actual threat that's 0. It's just my perceived threat is much lower. So it can just be a bit handy for a tank that's struggling a bit with some AoE aggro. So those are kind of the two situations that you use this skill for. But I definitely use it a fair bit, but it does have a long cooldown, so you can't use it too much. Next skill is Purge Poison. I almost never use Purge Poison except for like out of combat because it's really bad, and it's really bad because of this reason. Really long animation, and you can't move. It roots you in place. So in an actual fight, in an instance or a raid, it is really like bad to use because of how long it takes, and the fact that you can't move. It does target forward though, so you can cleanse off of other people with it, which can be helpful sometimes. Or if I really need to use it, like all my pots are on cooldown or whatever, and there's no one can, like, no captain or minstrel can use an AoE cleanse to get a debuff off me, and I need to use it, then I'll quickly like select myself, use it, but select a target and blindside to animation cancel it. Because that's really the only effective way to use it in combat. It does remove 2 effects, which is nice, but by and large, this is not a skill you're using in combat. You're just using pots, like removal potions. So that's why on Hunter it's extra important to make sure your removal potions are stocked up, because your personal cleanse is just so bad compared to other classes. So yeah, that's Purge Poison. Next we got Press Onwards. This is your big heal skill. So with Tracery and with the traits that you do in like a tanky line by getting the extra 10% from there, it can be up to like a 33.5% heal. And then if you have extra incoming healing on top of that, a lot of times it can be healing you for 50% or so. And it's only a 40-second cooldown with that Tracery. So Press Onwards is a very strong self-heal and incredibly good in fights like in Hidden Horde. If there's ever a time that you take a big chunk of damage, Press Onwards is excellent to be able to hit right away and heal yourself back up without a healer needing to divert focus to you. For instance, in Hidden Horde, the boss spits puddles out at people, and those puddles usually do like half of your health. But you get a puddle spat and you hit Press Onwards, you're basically full health right away. You know, situations like that, it can be very nice to use. And yeah, and it's such a short cooldown, it's pretty handy. Next, this one is actually racial, but I'll talk about it anyways, since most hunters tend to be elves. So this is Elder's Grace, 30-minute cooldown, but it gives you a huge amount of parry chance. This is another one I'll use if it's like I get something that's some melee enemy on me for a bit, and I'm waiting for like a tank. Popping this buys you 10 seconds of them barely being able to hit you, which is kind of nice. But yeah, super situational. Next, Cry the Hunter. So Cry the Hunter does several different things. It does a 5-second daze in an AoE radius around yourself. So it can up to 6 targets around you with that daze. So it can be really good if you're surrounded by enemies, need to move away from them or build space or whatever. This is a really good way to do that. The second effect it does is it gives you 10% run speed. However, it only does that if Find the Path is turned off. So in combat, in instances and raids, I always make sure Find the Path is not turned on so that I can get this run speed if I need it. If there's like a certain hit I need to run away from or ads I need to get away from, stuff like that, like I want this extra 10% in combat run speed, so I'll make sure Find the Path is off to be able to use it. Raids like Hidden Horde use it all the time. If you're in a bad spot for a breath from the boss that's going to hit you, you can pop this to get a bit of extra run speed out away from it. The last effect that's worth talking about here is that this is your daze recovery. It's like your stun recovery skill. So if you get knocked out or whatever, this is the skill you can use to wake back up again. The effect of it is a lot quicker now. They sped it up in a recent pass through stun recovery skills. However, this one is still pretty long compared to other classes. The animation is also pretty long with you like screaming like that. It also gives you a bubble, but as you can see, it sucks. And like hunters have like a tracery that can like improve bubbles or whatever, but with a bubble that size, no matter what percent improvements you give to it, it's still gonna suck. So the bubble is not really worth talking about. So yeah, mainly use this as a CC skill. Like a lot of times I'll use it to stun inductions from enemies if I don't actually want to select that enemy, because I can just stand near it and then instantly interrupt it with a daze. It's used for run speed and then also as your stun recovery. So it's pretty multifaceted, but it has a 1 minute cooldown, so you can't be using it all the time, but it's still a pretty good skill. Next is Intent Concentration. This one, it just gives you full focus, and that's all it does. You can trade it to give a power restore and reduce the cooldown, but that trait is just generally not worth using because it's very situational. If you die, get rezzed, I use it, or if you're in combat and had to run around a bunch and want to start opening up DPS again, but since you were running around, your focus is gone, then I'll pop this real quick, that kind of thing. It does root you in place, but it's a fairly quick animation. So like it takes about a second to use, but it can be situationally useful. And then the last bit of skills that are sort of relevant for combat ones are your stances here. So I'm going to take this opportunity to talk a bit about each of these stances, and give a reason why you would ever switch them. So your main stance that once you get legendary items that you're using is going to be Precision Stance. So Precision Stance, it does passive focus generation. Every 5 seconds it gives a focus, which is nice. It gives a big thing that it gives is quick shot crit chance. So in Precision Stance, quick shot has a much higher chance to crit. If you look at that tooltip there, it says plus 21% quick shot crit chance, which that is improved by a tracery. But when you're already sitting at over 30% range crit chance, another 21%, so you're sitting over 50% crit chance on quick shot, which is huge, especially when crits and devs lower the cooldown of Heartseeker and Upshot. So that alone makes Precision super good, but then also Precision intrinsically has a plus 22% bow crit multiplier. So just being in Precision gives you 22% crit multiplier, which is when you crit, you're critting 22% harder with that. So with all those effects combined, makes Precision like your best choice for stance. Also, when you first pop it, you get a finesse bonus, but that is not really super important because usually you have enough finesse anyways, just with your gear build and stats, which I will also cover in a little bit. Next stance is Strength. So before you get legendary items, Strength stance is the one you're using because most of the important effects from Precision are only really apparent after you get allies. So Strength stance at low levels is usually the way to go. So this one just gives you base induction and focus bow damage, which can be improved by both this trait and then also a tracery to get up to 16%. Also, when you first use it, you get a 10-second crit chance buff, which that is somewhat significant, and I'll talk about in a second, because that relates to your opening combo. You can do a bit of stance switching to get that extra bit of crit, which even if you're capped on crit, then it makes your crit magnitude higher, which then just makes your hits crit harder. Your last stance is Endurance. So Endurance stance is a sort of tanky survivalist stance. So your power cost is lower, which is not the most important thing, but kind of nice. But its main effects is that it makes quick shot heal you when you use it. And then it has an intrinsic parry and evade buff, as well as a 10 seconds. You get 10% evade when you first pop it. So this is kind of useful if you're trying to stay alive and heal yourself. You can give yourself a heal from quick shot, which it's a very small heal. It's like 10k, but you're spamming quick shot, so it does become noticeable. I also forgot to mention that the quick shot changes to have a slow in the Strength stance. So minus that, it gives you a run speed debuff when you use it, which makes Strength stance kind of nice in PvP for that reason. But those are your stances, almost always staying in Precision. I switch them in my opening combo to get that Strength crit buff. And I will show how that is done in a moment. So last, before I start talking about stats and builds and rotations and stuff is I want to talk about consumables, which are some of the things I've skipped over on my skill bar here. So some of your main hunter consumables that you use that are crafted by scholars are focus potions. So focus potions I tend to use with every other burn hot. So they have a 3-minute cooldown, burn hot's a minute and a half, and what they do is they give that 40% devastate magnitude. They also give you extra focus, but I mostly am using them for that devastate buff. You don't devastate super often, but if you have that combined with burn hot and then you devastate like a heart seeker or an upshot, it'll hit so much harder with that extra 40%. So I'm usually using it for an offensive buff for myself like that. Your other main consumables are bow chance and oils. Bow chance, the only one worth using really is breach finder, and even then it does barely anything. it at 2,800 skill damage mitigation modifier, so it pierces a slightly tiny bit of mitigation bypass, but it's so small at this level that it's almost nothing. But I mean, it is still something, and it's pretty easy to get one of these and throw it on, so tend to use them anyways. Other important thing is oils. So there's fire oils and light oils. So fire oils make a lot of your skills do fire damage, which kind of they changed the skill icons, and a lot of their damage types you see that does fire ranged damage now instead of Balerian. And then light does the same thing but switches to light damage. So these are really good in conjunction with different debuffs from other raid members. For instance, lore masters do a ton of fire debuffs on the enemies with some of their pets and some of their ground skills. So when there's a lore master there, it's almost always best to have fire oils on, because you'll do way more damage because they'll lower the fire mitigation so low. Light oils are good a lot of times with minstrels. However, that effect has been diminished with the most recent minstrel rework. So in general, it's just better to use fire oils unless there just isn't an LM in your group, but there is a minstrel, then you might use light oils. But fire oils are typically like a must-have for most like raiders and raid groups and whatnot. So those are your main hunter consumables. The last thing I'd recommend getting is oil wash, which oil wash isn't a consumable. It's like a permanent item that you just keep in your inventory and can use as many times as you want. And that removes oils. You get this from your class trainer, the hunter class trainer, just anywhere in the world. If you shop at then you can get an oil wash. This can be handy sometimes. There's some fights where maybe you need to take off fire oils for a certain target that might reflect fire damage or something like that. Or if you had fire oils on, but now there isn't an LM in the group, there's just like a Beorning, which with like something like a Beorning, it's best to have no oils because they just can reduce regular mits, not fire or light. So you can use oil wash to take off that kind of thing. So that's it with hunter specific consumables. There's some other consumables that can be good, which are just sort of generic ones that everyone uses, like scrolls, which can increase mastery and mitigations, hope, which can increase your health, and then food, which you can increase your resistances, and agility, which agility will affect some of your main stats like I'm about to talk about, and then regen food, which is really for power restore. The current highest end ones are fish plates, but I had a bunch of 9-star pies still, so I just use these because the power regen is about the same between them. And then there's premium buffs like store buffs, which you can get things like an attack tome for 5% damage, a morale and power tome for 5% morale and power, tome of defense, which are sort of required in high-end raids, which just reduce your incoming damage by 10%, and then mit tomes, which add tactical and physical mit. So those are all the sort of consumables that you would use. You also can have pots, which are like these down here. You have, for all your different effects, fear, wound, disease, and poison. Topping up on those is super necessary in a hunter because you're using them constantly versus other classes that might have their own useful cleanse skills. Hunter's cleanse skill kind of sucks, which forces you to use pots a lot. And then there's also things like power pots and morale pots that are also good to have in conjunction with your other heal skills you have. There's some other premium pots as well that are just sort of generically used between whatever class, but can be nice. So that is that with consumables. Next, I'm going to talk about stats that you want on Hunter, and then I'm going to go into gear, allies, and then finally the actual rotation and the way you want to use your skills. So Hunter is a physical class versus a tactical, so they care about physical damage and physical mastery. The main stats you care about is crit. You want to make sure crit is high. Crit affects a ton of your skills and directly affects how much damage you do. Physical mastery also affects your damage by a lot. So making sure your physical mastery is high enough is also important. You also want enough finesse. Finesse is one of those where you just want it to be high enough, but you don't need to work to make it crazy high. The main reason is that if you need to have a certain amount of finesse so that your attacks aren't getting, block, parry, or evaded, mostly evaded in the case of ranged hits. And then it has to be even a bit higher than that to reduce resists, which resists affect like a bleed. Like if, for instance, if you shoot a Heartseeker and then they resist the bleed, you're missing a lot of damage from that Heartseeker bleed not being there. So finesse being high enough is important, which that's usually around 600k mark is usually good enough. So past crit, mastery, and then finesse, you also care about mitigations, physical and tactical mitigations. In the current endgame at 140, Hidden Horde is the main raid, and in Hidden Horde, tactical mitigation is pretty important, especially in the last boss. There's a lot of tactical damage that you get hit with as a DPS. So tactical becomes a bit more important than physical to build. And it just kind of turns into building it as high as possible. Like ideally, if you could get capped mitts with having good offensive stats, that's the best. But at this point, capped for those stats is a bit higher than can be easily hit even with a geared hunter right now. So just getting as high tact mit as you can while also maintaining high crit is pretty important. Morale, while a lot of hunters like to build morale, I do not think it is great to build like vitality essences in your gear. I think getting straight mitts is a lot more important because a lot of the damage you're taking in the end game is percent damage, and percent damage hits harder the more morale you have because it's doing a percentage of your over morale. So it's instead better to just try to reduce the amount of damage you're taking in general rather than having a bigger health pool. Which I'll be reflected when I go through my gear and virtues. I'll just kind of see that I'm not super emphasizing morale. Like almost all the morale I have is from just the amount that's in the gear itself, not using any sort of essences. So in general, the order that you want to build these stats is first you want to get your crit as high as you can, close to max. So max for crit with a red cappy in a raid group, you need about 1.15 million with a red cappy, because red cappies give you extra crit buffs. Without a red cappy, you're looking at 1.22 is sort of what you want to hit cap. The cap itself is 1.247 mil, so about 1.25. So with 1.22, you get pretty close to that cap without a red cappy. And in the current endgame, there's a lot of fights where you might not have a red cappy. So that's why my like sort of default build here is I'm usually building high on crit like that. And then it's always, once you get a build you like, you can start making swap pieces to switch stats around for different comps or whatever. But yeah, so that's kind of what you want for crit. After you get your crit high enough, you want to try and make sure you have around 550k finesse at least. 600 is even better to reduce the amount of resists you're seeing. Higher tier raids usually require more finesse. Like by the time you're up doing like a T5 raid, you might need 700k plus on a hunter. But in general, 600k is a fairly decent rule of thumb. I would say like a 500, 550k minimum, so you're not getting a lot of your hits evaded, which is not good. But that's usually pretty easy to hit. Like, I don't have much gear that's really pointed at finesse. It just, you tend to get a decent bit just with the kind of gear that you have. After crit and then getting enough finesse, I'd actually say you want to get your mitigations high enough next before we worry about mastery. High enough, I would say, is try to get at least 600k tac mit if you want to join raids. If you're not doing a ton of like tier 2, tier 3 plus raids, the mits are less important. If you're just landscaping or you're running dailies, or you're doing 3-man, 6-mans, whatever, you can get away with a lot less tac mit, in which case you can then just go and look at mastery right away. But for a raid build, I'd recommend looking at tac mit. You won't really specifically build a ton of physical mits. They are still useful, but you can really only like fully build out one of the mits at this point, and tac mit is usually the better option. The cap for tac mit is pretty high on media. It's 1.32, which as like a hunter, you're not usually having a ton of intrinsic. You have to work hard to build your tac mit. So just trying to get that to at least 600k. Higher the better. I'd say on like tier 3, it's nice to have at least 800k for the tier 3 raid before buffs. But after you deal with mits, then you want to try and get mastery to cap. So mastery cap is 1.68 million. With a red cappy, if you have 1.58, you can hit cap. Without a red cappy, you need like around 1.62 million to cap. So my mastery in this build is a bit low because I went a bit harder into mitigation, because this is sort of the build that I use when I'm being extra tanky. I have some swap pieces I can put in to get my mastery up higher if I don't need to be quite as tanky. But in general, the cap for mastery is you're looking at 1.58 with the red cappy, 1.62 without one. So yeah, those are the kind of stats you look at. Crit, finesse, mits, mastery. Basically every other stat is meaningless as a hunter. To some extent, you care about morale, having enough morale. But if you're getting gear pieces, usually you can get enough morale from just the vitality that's in the pieces themselves that you don't need to go out of your way to get a ton of it. So that is stats. I'll relate that a bit to the consumables we talked about before, and like this, gives you agility. It's your bacon wrapped cabbage sprouts. Agility contributes mastery and crit. It gives 3 times mastery and then 1 times crit. So like something like this just helps you get an extra, almost 20k, over 20k mastery just from eating that food that lasts like 20 minutes. So agility is good for a hunter in that way, but main stat is usually not amazing. Like, you're not putting an agility essence in your gear just because it gives much less than if you just slot a crit essence or a mastery essence. So while it's helpful, it's not something you're prioritizing. Kind of same thing with the other stats. Might gives you almost nothing. Block and parry, useless. Vitality is really only useful for its health, but on a hunter you also get tactical mitigation from vitality, which just makes it a lot easier to build up your tac mit a bit higher. Will also is not much. You never want to build will. It gives some tactical mitigation. That's about it. And then fate is good for power regen. If you have at least 8k fate or so after buffs, usually fine. And in a raid group, you'll get in defensive Middle Earth from a captain, which gives you 3,000, and you also get Tale of Tales from Minstrel, which is another like 3 or 4,000 or something. That came with the most recent mini rework. So as an elf hunter, especially when you have the racial, that gives another 7k fate. You almost never need to worry about that. All right, so that is stats. That's kind of what you want to focus on on hunter stats. Next, I'm just gonna go through gear and set pieces for the current raid, And then after that, talk about allies. So for gear, starting with armor pieces, there are some fairly decent armor pieces you can get to get started on a hunter just from crafting, and then also running the 3-man raid or 3-man instances and 6-man instances. You can get usually enough gear to get started, but also just running T1 and T2 of the raid can start getting you a lot of gear that you need too. So I'm specifically going to talk real quick about the hunter sets. 3 hunter sets. You have yellow, red, and blue sets. The red set is the main set that you want 4 pieces of if you can get, which what does mean you have to get up through at least tier 3 boss 2 to get 4 pieces, because you get boots, legs, and chest can be dropped in T2. Boots can drop in T1. But then the 4th piece you'd get would be shoulders, which drop in tier 3 boss 2. And then tier 3 boss 3 can drop helmet, cloak, and gloves. But getting that initial 4 set can be really nice, because if you look at that tooltip there, it's a rain of arrows inflicts the barbed rain bleed on all targets hit. So that is just this bleed that's in the tooltip here, the 12-second bleed. And that improves rain of arrows a ton. It makes it really good for both single target and really good for AoE. So red 4 set is really the goal that most hunters are building towards at endgame right now. If you are able to raid more and do tier 3 raids, you can start building for a supplementary tier 3 or 3-piece set. In which case, for the 3 set, we're looking at either running yellow or blue. So yellow set, like I have on right here, the 3 set bonus is a 10% skill induction buff. So it makes your inductions 10% faster. That is really strong, and that is usually what I'm using as default. If I say you can only pick one extra 3 set to work towards, yellow is the one I would choose. You get most gains out of skill induction over the blue set, which is attack duration as its 3 set bonus. The only time that I use the blue set instead of the yellow is if there is a yellow warden in my group that is using adroit maneuver, which gives an extra 20% inductions. Then my inductions are fast enough with that alone that I can usually switch in my blue set and have just a bit of extra attack duration. But in general, the induction is much better than attack duration. You also get attack duration from other sources, such as Captain can trait to give an attack duration buff to everyone. That's fairly significant. And attack duration effectively caps out at 40% based off of some math that was done previously. So you don't need to go too far out of your way to build that. So that's kind of how you want to deal with your hunter set pieces. You want to go for 4 red as soon as you can once you start raiding. Before you get raid gear, you can get crafted gear or 3-man and 6-man gear that can get you geared enough to then start running tier 1, tier 2 raids. For jewelry, almost all this jewelry is from the raid. Earrings, some of your best earring options are this stylish loop, which drops from boss 2 on at least tier 2. It has physical mastery crit. Those are 2 of your biggest main stats. Another option you can have in some gear builds is there's another earring that has crit and finesse on it, which also can be good, especially if your finesse is a bit low. If you're struggling to hit that 600k mark, using one of those earrings can be one of your best bets. Before you can get into the raid, you can get earrings from, I think, some of the 3-mans and the 6-man also drop earrings. So those are some of your best bets, and there are also crafted ones. Necklace, the raid necklace that has tackmet and finesse is the one that I like using. Some other hunters will also use the teal necklace from the 6-man, which has, I think, mastery and finesse, if I remember correctly. But I like to use this one because this one has a lot of vitality, and since I'm not building vitality in my other gear pieces, I'm not using vitality essences anywhere, getting vitality from the gear itself can be nice to build up my morale. And then also tackmet is another thing that I'm wanting to build a lot of. So this tends to be my best choice. So bracelets, there's a couple different options. I'm using store of bracelets, which aren't necessarily the best option anymore, but just kind of how my build worked out here. I'm using one that has extra mitts on it, and one that has like finesse as well as crit and mastery. Other bracelet options is if you ran the Thrang event from the last festival, there were some crit finesse bracelets that were pretty good, and some mastery fate ones that were okay. Otherwise, bracelets are pretty sparse in the current endgame. A safe bet is in Gundabad, the reputation barterer there has some like yellow bracelets that you can get, or that are the lowest tier ones that are okay and can definitely be enough to get you started on your build. Until you can like run a festival, I guess, because they didn't want to put bracelets in their 3, 6-man or raid for whatever reason this cap. But yes, when Storvagan comes back around, those bracelets will probably be best in slot again if they get an item level bump or anything. But we'll see. Next are rings. Rings are also dropped from tier 2 plus raid. The best rings to get are the tack mitt ones. So agility, vitality, tack mitt. The other option is agility, vitality, mastery. But the tack mitt rings give you more than an essence worth of tack mitt, versus the mastery rings give you less than an essence worth of mastery. So it just makes the tack mitt rings much more efficient if you want tack mitt, and in this cap you want tack mitt. So these drop from boss 1 of the raid at least tier 2. So those are your best options to get. Before that, again, you can get crafted rings, or 3-man, 6-man also can drop rings that can get you started so you can get into the raid. And then the last piece of jewelry here is the pocket, which I am using the bell from Thrang. There's also the lash from Thrang, which some hunters use, which is good. And then otherwise, the raid drops a pocket that's pretty decent that you can get on even tier 1, that has mastery and crit on it, which that is what I'd probably suggest getting. You can also get a teal pocket from the 6-man, but I think the raid pocket's fine, and also has a lot of vitality on it, similar to like this necklace. But Bell is nice, has crit, finesse, and a lot of vitality. So if you have one from the Thrang event, I recommend using that. Or if your build can fit in a lash, then great, extra mitts. Last piece that you can get from the raid is the offhand. So offhand you can get from even tier 1 of the raid, just like the necklace in the raid pocket. I am currently using a tack mitt finesse offhand. Some other options that you can get that are decent include, there's one with physical mastery and finesse. There's also a dagger that has physical mastery and crit that can be pretty good. Offhand is just a really good place to kind of fit in whatever stats you need for your build. There's a couple different offhand options you can kind of do to complement your build the best. Like I often will use this mastery offhand as a swappy to get my mastery higher if I don't need quite as much tack mitt. So it can be kind of, you can change it to suit your current build the best. So another piece that is a crafted piece of gear is your tome here, your class book. So the best one currently is the crit version, the item level 455 version of the Gundabad Tome of the Whisper Draw. This one just gives you a bunch of morale. A scholar crafts it. It's pretty easy and cheap for a scholar to make, so it's pretty easy to get your hands on. The other option can reduce power costs, but is like super not worth it in the current raid. So it's in the current end cap, I should say, and so the max morale one tends to be better. So that is effectively, that's a lot of the gear pieces that you want and are looking for before you can get some of those crafted gear, 3-man, 6-man gear. Even some quest gear can be good enough just to get into the raid. T1 raid is pretty easy to get into. You can start getting some of these pieces, and then once you get some of those pieces and get more comfortable with running the raid and running your class, tier 2 raids are also not too hard to get into. And with tier 2 raids, you can basically have like all your jewelry set, your offhand set, and you can get a 3 set just from running tier 2 raids. You can get the boots, the legs, and the chest. And then that should, if you get all that set, then you can be fairly prepped to start getting into tier 3. So the last bit with gear that I want to talk about before jumping into LIs is the trigger essences. So most of all my gear pieces here, my essences are, I have a lot of mastery essences, I have crit essences, I got some tac med essences, just to kind of round out some of my stats. But in a couple of these specific pieces, I got some trigger essences. So in one of my rings here, I have the trigger essences I'd most recommend. Trigger essences you can get either by crafting last cap essences, so moonlit essences, warmly moonlit. When you craft them, there's a chance to crit and get a trigger box. Other more surefire ways to get them is if you run AD, the 130 raid at tier 4 or tier 5, that will unlock the ability to barter with Moat's trigger essences from Anak Kurfu in Elder Slade, or War of the Three Peaks, or whatever that region is called. And then running the stair battle tier 4, tier 5 lets you barter for fellowship triggers. They're expensive. They're 9,500 moats for a personal trigger, and then 9,000 for a fellowship trigger. But these triggers are very nice and can complement your build a lot. The crit triggers especially. So this first trigger here is a crit trigger. So on this one, whenever you hit something, there's a 25% chance of getting a 5% crit chance buff that lasts for 10 seconds and can proc once every 30 seconds. So that effectively boils down to just having a fair bit of extra crit chance fairly regularly, which just boosts the DPS a decent bit, especially when crits are so important for reducing the cooldown of Heartseeker and Upshot. This is classified as a Fury trigger. So if I can tooltip that alone, these triggers are Fury. You can only have one Fury trigger at a time. So for that one Fury type, this is the one you should be using. The next one down is a Fellowship trigger, which it works similar to the crit one, except instead of a 5% crit chance, it gives 2.5% mastery to your whole Fellowship. And if other people are using this essence, the effect can tier up. So you can stack with other people's procs at this as well. So this one is pretty nice, and especially since it helps everyone in your group, I recommend running it. And Fellowship ones don't have any sort of type classification, so you can have multiple different types of Fellowship triggers, like how I have this one. So this one is a MITS Fellowship trigger. It works the same as these other ones and how it procs, except that it does a 0.5% physical and tactical MITS, and it also can stack if other people are running that. I definitely recommend running that, especially in this raid and endgame where being tanky is really helpful. So those three are the three triggers that I feel every endgame hunter should be running. There's some other ones that you could run if you want to be extra spicy. One that I'm running is the one I have in my bell here, which is another crit one, except this is the healer one, the Beneficence type. So you can have a Fury and you can have one Beneficence. So this one, you don't really need this one. A lot of hunters don't run this one just because you have to use a healing skill to proc it instead of a hit. And the only skill you have that can proc it is Press Onwards. So Press Onwards is so Blood Arrow has a heal in it, but it does not count as a healing skill. So Press Onwards is the only healing skill that can proc this trigger. Because of that, it doesn't get procced super often, so a lot of hunters would rather just run a regular crit essence to get another 5, 6, 7k crit on it instead. I still run this anyways because you are using Press Onwards a decent bit in the current endgame. So it's if you're using it, you might as well go for a chance of an extra crit proc for some more damage. But this one is not really required. It's kind of more of a nice to have, and I just think it's worth running over a regular crit essence. Sacrifice like 5k crit and get the chance for that buff. So that is gear and essences. So next we're going to talk about LIs. So LIs on a red hunter are fairly straightforward right now. There's only a slight variations that some hunters are running over other ones. So I'm just kind of going to go down each LI here and kind of explain each of the sections. So starting off with heraldries. Oh, also, before I actually do that, bows are usually the preferred option over crossbows. If you're an elf, you should definitely be using a bow. That just goes back to this bow damage bonus. You definitely want that. If you're not an elf, you can use a crossbow. I have not personally tested animation differences, so I don't know if there's a huge difference, but if you're going for top DPS, you want to be an elf, you want to be using a bow. First slot, heraldry slot, you want to use the sparrow. Sparrow is usually the better option because it has more vitality, and like I said before, you're not really prioritizing vitality and essences or anything. So getting vitality from gear is nice, especially when a source like this is a pretty efficient place to get vitality. If you have the recipes for the from the reward track to get the special ones, Stalwart Sparrow is where I think is the best way to go. That gives an extra TACMIT percent. So by having 2 of those Stalwart Sparrows, you get the willpower set bonus, which is a 1.5% TACMIT. I'll talk a bit when I talk about the Words of Craft in a sec, but that is usually the best spot to get that TACMIT bonus from. Next, to talk about Words of Power. Words of Power, the best ones to run is both single target, both AoE and 2 dots. This currently is my old Parse build, but you want to have, instead of damage over time crits, AoE damage affects your overall damage a lot higher. In single target, you can kind of get away a bit without it, but in AoE, and especially in the raid, like AoE damage affects your overall damage by a lot. Especially since it affects 2 pretty hard-hitting skills. So usually you want to run both single target, both AoE, and then regular damage over time. Yeah, because these also affect your base damage, which is why they're so important versus affecting like mastery, which is less important. As far as words of what are these? Words of mastery is what they're called. There's a couple that you always want to have. So induction bow crit multiplier makes all your induction skills crit harder. Always want that. Induction bow damage. This affects your, I'm pretty sure it's base damage for your induction bow skills, which is another really huge one to get. Focus bow crit multiplier for your focus skills. Also very important. And then these 2 are the reason why you want to be using precision stance, especially after you have LIs. Before you have LIs, strength stance can be better, but after you have LIs, these make a big difference. So 22% precision stance critical magnitude, that is this buff that you just always have while in precision. So pretty important to have that affects all of your bow skills with a extra crit damage, pretty huge. And below that we have quick shot crit chance and precision, and then also the quick shot crit magnitude. So quick shot crits harder and then crits more often in precision. So if you look at this tooltip, it has 21% bonus quick shot chance. So that's only 10% by default in precision, and then that tracer gets that up to 21%. That's very huge in the fact that it affects the way that how many Heartseekers and upshots you can use, since crits reduce the cooldown, the active cooldown of those skills. So you always want those. And then naturally burn hot damage, you increase the effect of burn hot. So the gold is 38.5. So that makes that up to 78.5. So that is very strong, definitely worth having. You always want to have that one. Next, we have a bunch of different damage ones. So quick shot damage, swift bow damage, upshot damage, Heartseeker damage. So these are just 4 of your main skills that you're always using. That especially upshot Heartseeker, you definitely want those damage boosts. Quick shot, you're spamming that all the time, so that adds up in swift bow is another hard hitting skill. So those are always good to have. So next is where the last two are a bit more situational. At this cap, Rain of Arrows is really important because of that set bonus and how much AoE we're doing. So it's good to have the Rain of Arrows damage to boost that. And then Press Onwards is nice because in the current endgame raid, DPS take a lot of damage, so more self-heals is better. So that cooldown reduction is huge, and then also the extra healing on top of that to make Press Onwards a lot stronger. Other things that people have had in here are ones like Merciful Shot, cooldown and magnitude. So that one could be good, except that Merciful Shot doesn't currently work correctly. So that if you ever use Swift Bow to reduce the focus cost, it makes all of these words of power not work on it. So it hits a lot less than it should. And then another option that you'll see sometimes is the Strength Shot Slow Tracery, because a secondary effect on that one is it increases Quick Shot's bonus focus application chance. So kind of like this trait, it like boosts that, so that you have even more chance of getting bonus focus from Quick Shot. In a single target build, sometimes you'd run that. But in general, these are the ones that are best at the current endgame. With your Words of Craft, so right now, Heroic Precision, that one's really good. Heroic Precision does crit chance bonus. So if you have 2 of them, you get an extra 3% crit chance, and that goes on top of rating. So that's how you can get up to like a 33% crit chance. So 25% with rating, 3% with these traceries, and then 5% from this trait. So you get a 33% base crit chance. So these are really nice to have. And then your other ones are the Word of Craft Focus, which are from the reward track. So these ones, they give the 5% skill induction and then 8% on the gold, and they stack with each other. So you can have 1 gold and 1 teal to get a total of 13% skill induction, which is pretty nice. If you aren't able to craft these and also aren't able to craft your heraldries, it's best to use just regular sparrow heraldries, and then instead of these 2, you'd run 2 willpower to get the extra tackmit. If you're not super concerned with tankiness, if you're not doing high tier raids and whatnot, you can just go for 4 pure precision and get the extra crit, and that opens up essence spaces to use other things. Or something that hunters were doing was using 2 Ascendant Light to boost Exsanguinate, but that's pretty min-maxy as well and not super important. So in general, this is kind of what your allies look like. This damage over time crit should be AoE target. I just need to change that back from when I last was messing with it, or AoE damage rather, since AoE damage and single target damage are your 2 biggest ones. Some hunters would run the induction one here, but after some testing that the community did, it was found empirically that it affects DPS by far the least compared to all the other ones. So it's much better to just run 2 single target, 2 AoE, and then the dot damage. So that is that with LIs. Next, I will start going over some rotations, although I think actually I skipped over virtues earlier. Let me just do virtues real quick. So for virtues, ones that I always recommend, as far as offensive virtues, confidence and wit are 2 that you almost always want to have. Confidence gives you crit finesse. Wit gives you finesse, crit, and mastery. Those are 2 that I'm almost always using on DPS classes. Fidelity is another one that you almost always use, with that has Tackmit, Vitality, and Fizmit, which are all really important things you want to build a lot of. So even if I'm in full DPS, I still will usually have Fidelity slotted. Then the last 2 can kind of change based on my build. Currently, I have it set to Valor and Tolerance. Valor gives Mastery, Finesse, Crit. Tolerance is Tackmit, Resist, and Fizmit. So I currently have those. Other options that you can have if they better fit your build. Honor can be a good one with Morale and Tackmit. I don't really recommend Determination because Determination's main stat is Agility, which is just much less potent than like anything that doesn't use a main stat. So I would honestly stay away from Determination, but Honor is a good one. Loyalty you see sometimes. I'm not running Loyalty because Mitts is more important than Morale right now, so I'd rather have the higher Mitts I can get from something like Tolerance than Morale from Loyalty. Other ones are like Compassion, can get you more Mitts if you need Physmit instead. But in general, you know, these 5 traits that I'm running, plus like Honor maybe instead, are currently some of the better ones you can get for Hunter. So, with all that being said, let's talk about rotation. And then after I talk about rotation a bit, I'll wrap up with some plugins. Talk about some of the different plugins you can use. So Hunter rotation is a bit different from some other classes because it is less of a rotation and more of a skill priority. The priority of the skills is just kind of goes from some of your harder hitting ones and then some of your bleeds and debuffs. So if I set up a dummy here, I can start showing you some of what that rotation looks like. So in your rotation, you're spamming quick shot here. So that is the main skill you're using between everything. You're keeping this fast draw buff up that I have tracked right here. Looks like I'm on a bit of a laggy server, but it's fine. The other focus that you have is using pen shot every 10 seconds. So that keeps this buff on that I'm tracking here, and that is this crit and mitigation debuff on the enemy. So between using that every 10 seconds and quick shot as fillers, you're using these 2 skills fairly often. Your hardest hitting skills that you're always prioritizing are Heartseeker and Upshot. So you want to be using these off cooldown and make sure you use Upshot at full focus, which you can generate focus fairly fast when you're using quick shot spam. After these 2 skills being your main ones you're always using off cooldown, you also have your bleed skills like Barbed Arrow and Exsanguinate. Exsanguinate you proc with Blood Arrow. Most of the time, unless you're saving Blood Arrow as a corruption removal, you're just using Blood Arrow to get Exsanguinate up. And then you also have Rain of Arrows has a bleed associated with it. So you get your bleed skills up, you get your heavy hitters off. You can see there, my quick shot buff wasn't up, so that was a very long induction, versus if I have fast draw tiered up, it's much faster. You get procs like that. That is the proc you get for Swift Bow, which is given by quick shot. So you don't really need to pay too close attention to that. I tend to use Swift Bow just when I'm going to use it anyways, which is kind of around the same time you're using bleeds. You want to be using Swift Bow and Split Shot. So I use Heartseeker, Upshot. Those are on cooldown. Let me get my bleeds up so I do my bleed skills. And then I'm still waiting for those to be off cooldown. So let me use a Swift Bow, and then I can use Upshot again because it's off cooldown. Still waiting for some cooldown, so use Split Shot. You know, get my bleeds and pen shot up. So it's kind of a priority in that sense, where you're kind of going through your different skills, using them as they're up, but you're prioritizing certain ones over others. Like you're always making sure you get Heartseeker off cooldown, Upshot off cooldown. You want your bleeds and pen shot up. So that is kind of how it flows. It's a bit clunky right now just as I'm explaining it, but I'll do a parse in a second where you can just sort of observe more of what I'm doing. And then blindside you're using to cut things. So right there I used Split Shot or Swift Bow right into blindside to cut it so that its 3 arrow shot animation didn't have to go off. So like right here, if you watch this animation, like that one's kind of long, just comparatively. And then other animations like Rain of Arrows and Split Shot are kind of long, which I'll show those in a moment once the dummy is not green. So like Rain of Arrows is kind of a long animation as you shoot those arrows into the air, and Split Shot, as you like kind of lean forward and shoot, as a long animation. So those are the ones you typically want to cut with blindside. So when you do that, you can just start doing other skills again right away, which is super helpful. So that's kind of your skill priority. Big skills, bleeds, debuffs, and then your fillers with split shot and swift bow. And then if between everything, you're always just spamming your quick shot. So that's kind of what you're focusing there. Also in your rotation, you're using Burn Hot, using that at the beginning of the fight, and then usually using it off cooldown unless there's a specific burn window you're waiting for. When you use Burn Hot, you can actually cancel the animation of it. So first, I'll just use it so you can see the full animation. You just scream out and stand there, and then that gets Burn Hot on. When you use Burn Hot, you can move a bit, like a strafe or forward backwards, and that will cancel the animation of it, which is pretty handy. Yeah, like Zach's just did right there. So you can, when you're in combat, that is how you want to be using it. When you're out of combat, when you initially use it, you're usually in stealth, so you can't move, otherwise you break the stealth. But when you're in combat, you always want to be moving to cancel that Burn Hot. You don't want to have to sit through that animation, and you don't want to waste blindside to cancel it. So when I do a parse here in a second, you'll be able to see that fully. Last bit with the rotation that I'm going to cover right here is I'll go through my opening combo. So the opening combo is a bit trickier than just your regular animation and just like starting off with damage. So opening combo, you're always starting from stealth, and you want to have full focus. So if your focus isn't full, use improved focus to get to full. So when the fight is starting, I usually start with Burn Hot once that's off cooldown, but I also mess with the stance switches like I was talking about before. So the stance switching, you're doing that to get the extra crit on strength stance, but if you hit both the stances fast enough back to back, you can get right back into precision without having to wait for the extra cooldown. This is a tidbit that has been very, very helpful in maximizing the amount of time you get with that 10-second crit buff. So I have them set to my thumb mouse buttons right now, so I can just hit one or the other very quickly from just my mouse hand, which looks like this. So that skipped right into precision, but it still did strength, so I still got that strength stance buff ticking. You can also just do that by hitting the keys, and if you're fast enough, you can click them to get the same effect. They just have to... If you do it with the keys, you basically want to hit them almost simultaneously, with just strength stance like slightly ahead. But I think it has to be somewhere around like a half second with each other or quicker to get that effect to go like that. So I combine that with Burn Hot, and then finally right before I do my first hit, I use Focus, and I hit it again to cancel it, just to get this buff. But you don't want to sit through the full thing because your Burn Hot is going, your strength and stuff is going, so you just want to hit it and then hit it again to instantly cancel it. And then you open with your first skill. So to put that all into practice, I'll sit here in Endurance Stance. I have full focus. The fight's starting, so I do Burn Hot. When the animation finishes, I do my stance switches. I do Focus, Heartseeker, and then cancel the Focus, and the Heartseeker goes off. And that gives you a lot of time there to then do a lot of your skills with those buffs going. From that Heartseeker, usually your next skill you hit is Pen Shot, so you get that buff up right away. From Pen Shot, you usually use a Blindside. You're not using it as an animation cancel, you're just using it to quickly get your focus instantly back up so you can go into a full focus upshot. So it's Heartseeker, and then you go bam, bam, bam. Pen Shot, Blindside, Upshot. And you're getting all that within the window that your improved focus buff is getting. After the Upshot, I usually will do one Quick Shot, and then into a Blood Arrow, and then Exsanguinate, and that's basically like the end of the opening combo there. So the reason that I do those skills, some hunters might do some different, they might do a Swift Bow or something else, is that Blood Arrow intrinsically crits hard. So a crit with Blood Arrow has like extra crit magnitude in it. So I want to get that off in the window that Improved Focus is doing, since Improved Focus has that bonus crit multiplier. And if it's all fast enough, that Blood Arrow hit goes off just inside that extra window. So by going Heartseeker, pen shot, blindside, upshot, and then a single quick shot to build enough focus and then get the blood arrow off. That is all within that window. And then you usually just follow up the blood arrow with Exsanguinate, get that up, and then you can start going through your regular rotation skill priority, which includes, you know, you get barbed arrow up, you want to get rain of arrows up, you know, you're keeping pen shot going, that whole thing. Also, real quick, just while I have to wait, I'm going to wait for this cooldown, but I want to show you, like Zach said earlier, if you do burn hot right and move correctly, it almost looks like the animation didn't even go off. Like that. So if you use burn hot in combat, you just want to do a quick just movement, just like tap a movement key. It has to be a strafe, it can't be a turn. So either forward, backward, left, or right. But you just tap it that quick, and then boom, burn hot goes off. Alright, so to wrap up this stuff, I'm going to get out of combat, and I'm going to do a full 3-minute parse here, just so that you guys can kind of see how that looks with my skills. I'm also going to try to click the whole thing, which I'm not used to, but I just think it's a lot easier for you guys to see what I'm clicking. I highly, highly recommend that if you're practicing a hunter, you are practicing with a lot of keystrokes instead of clicks. I can do basically my full rotation from keystrokes just after a bunch of practice, and that is huge because in an actual fight, you don't need to pay attention to what your skills are doing, really. You can just be kind of paying attention to the cooldowns of skills, and otherwise you can be paying attention to the fight itself, which as a DPSer in a raid, I think is a very valuable skill to have. So even just to start, if you can get 3 skills that you use with keys, like if you can get, you know, your blindside, interrupt, quick shot, and then maybe like pen shot or upshot or something. If you can get those that you're using with keys instead of clicking, that will help you immensely, even if you click everything else. So when you practice a hunter, I highly, highly recommend that you're using keys for a lot of your skills. But in this instance, I will be trying to click so you can see my skill rotation here. See, I'm going to put fire oils on because I usually parse with fire oils, so I know my skill counts best when I have fire oils ticking. We're going to go into stealth, go into endurance stance here, and then when those cooldowns are up, we can get going. I also will use a focus pot in the very beginning so that any devastates I have are extra high. So let's do it. Alright, and then I'm getting bleeds up. Get my next upshot. Make sure my sanguinate's good. Hit a bit of an early barb there, but that's fine. Between skills, you're spamming quick shot to get focus back and get your crits from them. Because quick shot crits are pretty bountiful and give you more upshots and more Heartseekers. Also, another thing to note is that from Barbed Arrow and from Heartseeker, you want to lead into a focus skill if you can. That's just an effect of how attack duration works with them, is you get more benefit from going into an instant skill rather than an induction skill. Because if you do, like, here, let me do a barbed in this parse and go into a quick shot, you'll see it takes like a half stutter second there to get that off, versus if I went into an instant skill. So I highly recommend doing that. This is a bit of a slotty parse. I'm just not used to clicking, but you should be able to see sort of what my skill priority is looking like. Burn Hot's almost up. I'm actually going to wait to use Burn Hot until Heartseeker is almost up, because then there's a chance I can get 2 Heartseekers off in one Burn Hot if I get lucky with crits. So Heartseeker's up. I'm going to use Burn Hot. Did my quick little movement. If I, oops, I had the wrong skill there. If I had my focus pot up, I would use the focus pot as well. If you also do line up Burn Hot well, you can get 3 upshots in one Burn Hot pretty easily. So like that, I didn't have good RNG. I had still a long cooldown left on Heartseeker by the time Burn Hot was gone. So I'm still just kind of working my way through my skill priority. I don't want to let my bleeds fall off for too long. And I don't want to let upshot be off cooldown for too long either. So we're almost done with this parse. Parse on a dummy is 3 minutes. It's a great way to just kind of practice your rotation. This one isn't going to be particularly great just because I'm not used to clicking all these skills like that, but it'll get you a rough idea. It's really nice to use Swift Bow right after upshot, get your focus back up. So yeah, that was a 406 parse, but more importantly is what the distribution looks like. So in this distribution, let's see, we had 19 upshots. It's very low, but I was in a kind of an uncomfortable rotation. You want to look for at least 21, 22 upshots in a parse is the number you're looking for. Quick shots, that's about right. You want to have around 90 quick shots or so, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. 42 Swift Bows is good. 8 Heart Seekers is good. You want 8 to 9 Heart Seekers. My exsanguinates are low. It looks like I missed an exsanguinate. You're usually looking around like 85 to 90 ticks of exsanguinate. Burning Arrow around 90. That's good. I had 10 Rain of Arrows, which is okay. 19 pen shots. Usually want at least 18. Around 18 pen shots is about the one per 10 seconds you're shooting for. So, you know, so this was like an okay distribution. My biggest problem here is the upshots were low. Overall damage was a little bit low too, but I was, you know, trying to click everything. But that is more or less what you want to be doing on a hunter rotation with the skill priority. So last thing here before we wrap up is I'm going to talk about some of the main plugins that I'm using on Hunter. First, this one I was just using right here is Combat Analysis. So Combat Analysis, it lets you track your skills. You can see your total DPS. You can select like per target in a fight as well. It's super useful that way. You can look at if your hits are even hitting or missing, which can help you determine how much finesse you need. You know, how much crits and devs you have, and it can look at per skill. Like if I look at Heartseeker, I can see that I had 1 Heartseeker devastate, and I had 4 Heartseeker crits, which were showing up down here. So it can kind of be helpful when you're, especially when you're parsing and trying to, you know, get your damage up to speed. You can also see how much heals you're getting and how much damage you're taking in a raid fight, which can be useful. Combat Analysis is pretty useful. Another one that I was using a lot is called Skill Timer. So Skill Timer, I have a bunch of different timers here set. Like if I use Burn Hot, it has like a timer ticking in it. That's caused from Skill Timer. I use it to track some of the bleeds as well. So if I use like Barbed Arrow, I have it set to show a 12-second timer duration, which that's the duration of the bleed, so that I can track the bleed just by, you know, glancing at the skill. You know, there's a couple different ways and different plugins you can use for this, but that's just kind of what I have. One that I'd recommend for hunters that are just starting out is Auras. So Auras kind of bakes a lot of your stuff into one plugin here, so you don't have to worry about setting up a bunch of separate things. It tracks your skill cooldowns. It can track your amount of focus, like it shows I have 9 focus. Buffs and bleeds, it will track like above the skill bar there. It's a pretty handy place to track most of your important stuff in one spot without needing to set up a bunch of different plugins like I have. I also had like some plugins that were tracking there. I have buff bars that I use that was tracking my fast draws, tracking my pen shot, and I also had one that was tracking swift and true. Is it? No, what's the name? Needful Haste. That's the one. Needful Haste is a buff that I track that you don't really need to track because it's basically intrinsic. It just quickens some of your inductions and like swift bow induction, and it just procs on ranged hits. So it's very often going to be up. You don't really need to worry about it. But yes, like I use buff bars, I use Combat Analysis, but I'd say a lot of hunters can get a lot of mileage out of Auras, just all baked into one. And all these plugins are available in the plugin compendium. that can be used. Also in buff bars, I had a slider going through the middle of the screen here. I was checking some buffs. That was also via buff bars. Yeah, those are the really the only plugins that I use a lot on my hunter. And then with that, I think that is everything that I was looking to cover today. A couple general tips that I want to throw in just for raiding hunters, if you're getting into raiding, is stuff with positioning. If you want to do max DPS in a raid, positioning actually can be pretty important. If you have a red cappy, being close that you're in a red cappy banner is important, but also if there's like a guardian, being close enough to the tank so if a guardian uses break ranks, you get that, can be important too. So being cognizant of other buffs that others can give you from like guardian or captain or whatnot, and making sure you're in range of them is pretty important. Same goes with Mini. Mini has a lot of buffs you want to be in range of. So I know it's really fun to be like a max range hunter hitting stuff. A lot of times it can be to your detriment to do so. But yeah, with that, I guess I am open to any questions that any of you guys have.